Is it full screen? At the top right. Okay. And then go to the PowerPoint over the bottom, very bottom left. Yeah, click on that.
I could also go to my file from there.
Yep. The Zoom.
Okay, it is recording.
Okay, very good.
That's
Thank
what
you.
it says.
Exit full screen or minimize it.
Are you able to see the presentation there in Broken Arrow?
Go to
No, we are not.
links at the bottom.
Okay, we're still getting it set up.
Right here.
It's loading,
Yeah, one of
but we'll
those.
make sure
Maybe
we
the
share.
Probably the last one.
I probably should have made Dr. Owen another alternate host. I made you an alternate. I'm going to go ahead. That looks lovely.
From the beginning.
Pamela, can you see that now?
Yeah, well, I can, and it's being displayed at the back of the room.
Okay. Our folks that are joining us from various locations, are you able to see Dr. Owen's presentation? Who else with
Chris
us?
Clark.
Yeah, we can, I can see it.
Okay, okay. Oh, did I just do a bad? Are we still okay? Our friends from other locations.
We are still okay here. We
Still
don't.
good. I can see the presenter notes as well, but that's okay by me. Ah, there it goes. There's the.
Oh, but did you lose the presentation now?
No, I can still see it.
And we can see it here as well in the back.
Okay, I hope, oh my gosh. Let's try.
Let's see when I start the slideshow.
I'm not familiar enough with how to put that
That's
up
great.
here.
Oh, they can't see
We
me.
just, can you all see us as well, Pamela?
Pardon?
Can you see our camera mode, like our table?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so they can see us.
We just can't
We
see
just,
that.
we're not able to see you right now, the way we've got two sides of PowerPoint. So we'll just do that. That's okay. And then we can minimize here at the end if there's any questions. Does that sound okay?
That sounds lovely.
Okay.
Well, it sounds like we're ready to get started. I'll just very quickly say a couple of words. Thank you all for joining the Faculty Council presentation. We are continuing our Hawk Talk presentations this semester. And this afternoon, we have Dr. Christopher Owen from the College of Liberal Arts History Department. He's going to be speaking today. His presentation is titled "A Lion in the Classroom, Wilmore Kendall's Call to Teach in Cold War America." And Dr. Wilmore Kendall is one of our own. He was born in Oklahoma in the early 1900s and was quite a colorful and controversial intellectual of the Cold War era. And so today, Dr. Owen will discuss with us his ways of being a conservative writer and innovative political theorist, and how he exercised quite a bit of influence, most famously at Yale, teaching students such as William F. Buckley Jr. and L. Brent Bozell Jr. So for this talk, Dr. Owen will focus on Dr. Kendall's long and contentious academic career and show how and why he was such an effective teacher and one who influenced the lives of his students and thereby changing the world.
Thank you, Pamela. I really appreciate it. I'll go ahead and get started, and I'll just try to illustrate it as we go along with the PowerPoint slides. So often when we talk about teaching, we focus most of our attention on techniques of instruction, pedagogical methods, best practices, and so forth. And to be sure, such discussions can be useful for us as we interact with our students and attempt to instruct them. However, today I would like to propose that to understand college-level teaching rightly and to practice it properly, we must come to see our task as a calling and not merely as a job. To flesh out this proposition, I'm going to draw upon my own current research, a project from which I have myself already learned many lessons, a number of which I've already applied in the classroom. Specifically, I have for the last couple of years been at work doing archival research and writing about the Oklahoma-born Cold War political theorist Wilmore Kendall. The project will in time result in a book-length biography entitled Wilmore Kendall, Tribune and Teacher of the American People. Learning about Kendall has been a fascinating endeavor, for he had something of a 1950s Mad Men persona. But the project has also helped me learn that it is utterly false to say that one cannot teach an old dog new tricks, for although I am now some decades into my career as a college professor, investigating Kendall's life has helped make me a better teacher. In the spring semester of 2015, that is about 3 years before the Great Seminary Hall flood, I was teaching my favorite history class, American Intellectual History. This course, usually taught together with the graduate section of American Studies, has for many years been a useful and productive one. Several MA theses have grown out of student research papers originating in this class. Moreover, I've always taught the class in seminar style, focusing on extensive discussion of key original texts. Give and take between the students and myself has always been instructive and enjoyable. For 20 years and through several editions, I have assigned a 2-volume text called The American Intellectual Tradition, edited by David Hollinger and Charles Capper. It's a good book with select readings which cover the main currents of American thought, from Puritanism to postmodernism, but like many works in the academic world, it tends to privilege left-leaning ideas and to underrepresent conservative points of view. Therefore, I've usually tried to balance Hollinger Capper with a right-leaning monograph or two. And in 2015, I struck gold by assigning William F. Buckley's God and Man at Yale, a book which I had long heard about but had never actually read. God and Man at Yale is an important book.
Before. Oops. No, not now.
Well, I guess I'll just do it that way. It's an important book. Many scholars view its 1951 publication as the starting point for modern American conservatism. By criticizing the overwhelming liberalism practiced at his alma mater, a liberalism often at odds with the values of Yale alumni, Buckley launched his memorable career. With the notoriety gained from God and Man at Yale, he went on to found National Review. Let's see if you can see that there. You might
Can you
notice.
see the change of the screen?
You see the changing screen, or are you just seeing the goobered up title?
Or did we lose them?
Or did we lose them completely?
I can still see the screen.
Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint at all?
Yes.
And can you see the changing slides in the PowerPoint?
I can see the
Or
non-presentation. It looks like I can see the edit mode of the PowerPoint.
I don't know one. Okay, there we go.
Why don't we just stay on that screen?
And
and
how do I
We'll just keep
clicking?
clicking.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Paul.
Thanks. So there you see the first edition, November 19th, 1955 of National Review. William F. Buckley as the editor-in-chief, Wilmore Kendall listed there at the bottom as one of the founding editors. So Buckley, with the notoriety from God and Man at Yale, went on to found National Review, which was long the nation's most important conservative news magazine, to host Firing Line. There he is on Firing Line. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that on PBS. And ultimately to become a major power broker in promoting the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. But truth be told, assigning this book was a mark of my own naivete as an intellectual historian. For Buckley was not really an intellectual, though he did play one on TV. And any of you old enough to watch Firing Line and have heard his amazing accent will kind of know what I mean by that. Rather, the gold I struck in God and Man at Yale was running across the name of Wilmore Kendall. Kendall was Buckley's politics professor and mentor at Yale, and it was he who inspired Buckley to write his conservative classic and who also helped him to edit it. A cosmopolitan populist, lanky, loquacious, and learned, Wilmore Kendall almost always impressed people he met, but he often terrified them too. He was a chain smoker, 5 packs a day. Heavy Scotch drinker, womanizer, who loved to talk, to think, and to write letters, almost always in his signature green ink. For example, I remember one letter which I found at the archives of Stanford's Hoover Institution, written to the great political philosopher Leo Strauss, and detailing some abstract and insightful notions about the political concepts of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract. But the note was written on a bar napkin from a Spanish hotel. Perhaps the spookiest assessment of Kendall came from an old acquaintance, Nobel Prize-winning author Saul Bellow, whose 1968 short story Mosby's Memoirs depicted a fictional Willis Mosby, clearly modeled on Kendall. Mosby, sipping mezcal in a Oaxaca cafe while writing his memoirs, was cynical, drunk, world-weary, and hell-bound. As a subject for a biography, then, Kendall has been fun, for he was a bit larger than life. And back in the day, this sometimes overwhelming persona was a magnet for students, and especially for bright students. The more I read about Kendall, the more I read Kendall's own writings, the more intrigued I got. Discovering no one had written his biography, I knew this was the project for me and dropped my other research efforts. Having just directed 3 MA theses on American intellectuals, I had a pretty good idea about how to proceed writing something along the same lines. Kendall, I knew pretty quickly, was the right subject. It's exciting to read Kendall. He makes his readers think, most always approaching familiar subjects from unexpected angles, and often from angles rooted in his Sooner State boyhood. Researching and writing about him has been intellectually stimulating and enjoyable. My brain's so full of his ideas that I bother my colleagues, my friends, and my family by talking about him way too much. Over his lifetime, Kendall would exercise public influence mainly in 3 areas: as an intelligence officer, as a popular writer and lecturer, and as a political theorist. So this is Kendall in 1946. He's still in a precursor of the CIA at this point. He was an important founding figure of the CIA, composed some of the earliest treatises on psychological warfare, and crafted extremely effective propaganda during the Korean War. In 1955, he, together with Buckley, co-founded National Review, where he served as a columnist and senior editor for nearly a decade. Today, Kendall's probably best remembered for his political theory, which I think probably will provide his most lasting legacy into the future. He idealized the deliberation function of Congress, feared bureaucratic elites, and expressed skepticism about individual rights as a basis for public policy. While speaking to students or to colleagues, Kendall loved to shock his audiences. In September 1956 speech, for example, he horrified a mixed group of libertarians and conservatives with his argument that the people of Athens had acted correctly when they sentenced Socrates to death. Despite these various important accomplishments in public life, Kendall himself saw his chief vocation as being a teacher. And based on the achievements of some of his students, one could argue that he exercised his most important public influence in this way. In fact, when the name Wilmore Kendall comes up in our own day, sort of as we started out this own talk, it usually comes up in a sort of reflected glory or reflected notoriety, depending on one points of view when reading about the achievements of his famous students. At Yale, for example, Kendall propelled not only Buckley toward fame and fortune, he also pushed L. Brent Bozell Jr. There's Bozell and Buckley. They were a famous debate team at Yale. They may have been drunk in this picture, which is quite possible. This is L. Brent Bozell Jr., who's the father of the current Bozell III, who's a conservative activist of his day. He was a founder of Young Americans for Freedom, Ghost wrote Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, several other things. Was a minion, I guess, of Kendall at Yale. Prominent American Cold War diplomats John Negroponte, Charles Lichtenstein also received a significant inspiration from Kendall at Yale. At LSU in the late 1930s, Kendall taught future Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and he later agonized about Humphrey as a liberal Democrat as the one who went astray. Although I'm finding Kendall's ideas about the Cold War might have influenced Humphrey quite a bit, more than we realize. Less famous students also testify to Kendall's impact as a teacher. Oscar Pimentel, for example, was a Kendall student at Yale. Taking Kendall's course, Classics in Political Thought, said Pimentel, was the most dramatic and transforming experience of my intellectual life. It led him to change his career to political science. Pimentel regarded Kendall as the major formative influence on his scholarly career. He later founded Black Pine Circle School and the Institute for Active Learning, both in Berkeley, California, where Pimentel promoted a Socratic style of student-centered learning. Like Kendall, he was neither a conservative nor a Catholic, but he regarded his bond with Kendall as totally personal, a friendship which would not be compromised if the other didn't agree about this or that. Pimentel declared upon hearing of Kendall's death that he would always celebrate the life of Wilmore Kendall, and the school that I am building, he went on to say, will be a monument so Kendall may forever be remembered. Cold War Romanian refugee Ilias Smoltea also testified to Kendall's powerful impact as a teacher. It was with joy and pride that I was preparing for the privilege of telling Dr. Kendall that I had completed my PhD at Berkeley, wrote Smoltea to Kendall's widow Nellie in 1967. I'm very unhappy I wasn't able to do it. He was very much concerned about my ability to secure a better life for myself and my family, especially since he knew about the years I'd spent as a political prisoner. He was a very great and generous man, Mrs. Kendall. I met him at Yale 10 years ago, and he's remained the most brilliant intellectual I've known in this country. Someday I may be able to find a way of telling it publicly. Late in his career as head of the politics program at the University of Dallas, Kendall continued to inspire numerous students. One was Catholic educational leader, school sister of Notre Dame, Mary Bryant Bowl. There she is. Who held numerous leadership positions at Catholic schools in Texas and Japan. I had the pleasure of interviewing Sister Mary Bryan last year in Dallas. She remembered distinctly being on campus and talking to Kendall on the day he died, shortly after he taught a class. Tearing up a bit, she spoke of how profoundly Kendall had moved her as a teacher and said that she still saw Kendall as her intellectual father. In Dallas, I was also able to talk to several other devoted Kendall students who had gone on to become scholars and professors. Among these were Professors Leopold de Alvarez and John Alvis, both of whom taught our own NSU Professor Emeritus Joseph Faltz. Over the phone, I also conversed happily with Professor Don Strock, who had worked with Kendall at Stanford and whose career Wilmore had helped push forward. Strock, in turn, became the mentor of NSU's own Dan Savage, who's here, in the political science program at UC Santa Barbara. So I guess that would make Kendall the grand mentor, if that's a thing, of at least two members of our NSU family. Even when praising Kendall for the pedagogical magic he worked on students, some famous and others less so, the full story, typically for Kendall, also reveals more than a hint of Wilmore the bad boy. For amongst his high-achieving students were Kendall's first two wives. Catherine Tuock Kendall, here she is. She first met Wilmore in 1930 when she was a freshman at the University of Illinois, and he was her 21-year-old French instructor. They married in 1935 and divorced in 1950. Catherine became one of the founders of the field of international social work and taught many years at the University of Minnesota. Wilmore met his second wife, Anne Brunsdale, in the late 1940s when she was in his political science class at Yale. Here's the best picture I got of her. Not a great picture. There's their marriage from 1952. After recruiting her into the CIA, Kendall and she married in 1952. After their 1956 divorce, Anne in time became director at the American Enterprise Institute and chairwoman of the International Trade Commission under President Reagan. Kendall's third wife, Nellie Cooper Kendall, had not been one of his students. She was an ex-Marine and was able to keep him a bit more under control. So the main question I want to address in today's talk is what made Kendall such a great teacher, one who was so attractive to students, especially, I guess, to his female students, and who had such a tremendous influence on those he taught. William F. Buckley, for example, called Kendall the best teacher he ever had and also the most difficult human being he ever knew. My main contention in this talk today is that Kendall was a great teacher, mainly because he accepted teaching as a calling, not merely a so many courses per semester job. Kendall literally gave his life in serving his students. As a human being, Kendall spent his entire life in higher education, entering graduate school at age 2. I guess I'm going to have to explain that one, so I'll explain it. Reverend Wilmore Kendall Sr., I got a picture of him. No, I don't have him. I'll just explain that. I guess I may have a picture of Kilmore Sr. So Kendall's dad was a Reverend Wilmore Kendall Sr. He's a blind Methodist minister. In 1911, with baby Wilmore in tow, Reverend Kendall enrolled in Garrett Theological Seminary at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. His wife, Anna Garlick Kendall, read the assigned books aloud to her husband while baby Wilmore played with Montessori letter blocks and a typewriter. He soon shocked his parents by starting to type out words. Realizing he had a child prodigy on his hands, Reverend Kendall pushed his oldest son relentlessly, with, I think, a great deal of psychological costs for his son, living vicariously through his son because he felt himself his professional prospects were limited by his inability to see. At age 13, Wilmore this is a picture from 1921. You can see he's the kid that's standing out there, right? So he's age 12. He's wearing, one thing, I didn't know this, but when you're a little kid, before you're grown up, you wear knee pants. I didn't know that. So he's still wearing knee pants in the Lanier English Club, age 12. He graduated the next year, age 13, from Mangum High, and then he enrolled as a freshman at Northwestern at age 13. That was very psychologically damaging for him. He was still in his knee pants when he entered in his freshman class, which he said was psychologically devastating. By the way, Farina just walked in. I saw this very porch in Lawton when we were visiting where this was taken. This was Lawton High School, 1921, and the building's still there. So that was kind of cool to see. Anyway, he wasn't ready socially. Let's see what I got next here. Oh yeah, there he is. He's in the ROTC, or whatever was the ROTC then, youngest cadet in America, Northwestern University, 1922, meeting a World War I General Mosley there. He only lasted a semester at Northwestern, but he continued to pursue an accelerated education regimen. Got his BA from OU at age 18, his master's from Northwestern at age 19. He got 2 master's degrees from Oxford in 1936, and he got his doctorate from the University of Illinois in 1941. He taught at almost a dozen colleges and universities, most of them first-rate, over his academic career. Kendall lived and died as a teacher. Dallas students recall him in class, suddenly shuddering, becoming very still, remaining silent for a full minute as his lips turned blue, then popping a nitroglycerin pill, recovering his poise to continue the day's lessons. Much of Kendall's success derived from his captivating and self-confident presence. Let's see, I don't know what my neck up. That's him. I think that's him kind of in his glory days. He was sometimes called a learned hick. So his accent was called Okie Oxford. And some people said that Buckley kind of copied it from him. Probably not, but that's what some said. According to John Alvis, a student in Kendall's undergraduate courses in American politics, found himself confronted with a teaching style compounded of Southwest idiom, ironically displaced social science jargon, and deftly convoluted Miltonic periods inherited from his eloquent minister father. His accent alone, Okie Oxford, grabbed the attention of impressionable students. To students and colleagues, he was a lion in the classroom, a learned logician who appeared overawing, unshakably self-confident, capable of taking the measure of the best minds of his profession. In private scholarly dialogue, he might express doubts about his understanding of theoretical problems, but he almost never did so in the classroom. So one lesson we might learn from Kendall is that to inspire confidence in students, you need to appear confident even when we don't know what you're talking about, but ideally you should know what you're talking about too. So better a lion than a mouse, I suppose. On the other hand, Kendall's learning was indeed vast and his intelligence great. He constantly read and thought about political theory. Intellectual command of his subject was not feigned. Moreover, his views on political theory were not merely academic. That is, Kendall really thought what he was teaching about mattered. And what he was teaching about, that is, what mattered most to him, was the proper functioning of democracy. He believed that his teaching was a matter of life and death, if not for individual students in his classes, then for the American Republic to which they belonged. Kendall was a passionate person, a passionate scholar, and a passionate teacher. It was difficult, ultimately impossible for him to separate the intensity with which he held his political theory from his career as a teacher. His uncompromising, even messianic brand of conservative anti-communism won relatively few friends among the left-leaning academics who even then dominated the political science profession, but his passionately held and cleverly articulated ideas did inspire his students, most of whom seldom heard such things from their other professors. Because Kendall viewed political theory as so important to get right, we need to review what he taught his students. In his classes and in his scholarly writing, as opposed to his popular speeches and magazine articles where he let loose a little more, Kendall focused on explication of political theory and mostly tried to distance himself from current events. The best quick way to summarize his theory, which is actually quite intricate and many-layered, is to ponder the preamble to the United States Constitution. Kendall held that the framers in this one sentence had summed up how democracy should work. I put in the bullet point things there, which aren't in the original, of course, but if you look at the slide, you'll see a couple of things basic to Kendall's thought. First is that we, the people, are sovereign in a democracy. That is, it is we who make the government, who ordain and establish it, and it is only we who can properly remake it. The only alternative to majority rule, Kendall taught, was ruled by some minorities, usually some self-selected and privileged elite. Furthermore, democracy, though the best form of government, is always difficult to maintain because it involves a balancing act between different values, especially these 6 that are listed up here as in the preamble. Push any one of these values too far at the expense of one or more of the others, and political discord will surely follow, he believed. To pursue justice, let's say, to the detriment of domestic tranquility, for example, leads to anarchy. On the other hand, to pursue domestic tranquility at the cost of justice produces dictatorship. Responsible citizens of a democracy then need to elect representatives who can deliberate wisely so as to preserve democracy by keeping all 6 attributes in balanced tension. Kendall spent his life developing this complex vision of how democracy functions best. He thought that conveying it to his students really mattered, and many of them noticed and were impressed by his ideas and by his commitment. The value of knowing one's subjects and of caring deeply about it then are further pedagogical takeaways from Kendall's story. As regards teaching technique, Kendall used several methods. This research project on Kendall has helped me realize that when we use phrases like sage on a stage or guide on the side, we are most often using rhetorical shortcuts, often agenda-driven to describe the more complex realities of what good teachers actually do. For as an instructor, Kendall, like all effective instructors, worked both as a sage and as a guide. As regards political theory, he fit the textbook definition for sage, that is, a person famed for wisdom, and surely we can agree that students benefit from having learned teachers rather than foolish ones. However, Kendall, during his last years at the University of Dallas, taught on an actual stage. For the university, built an amphitheater-style classroom especially to showcase the talents of its star professor. There is some irony in applying this terminology to Kendall, for he himself often used the word sage sarcastically. probably having in mind Oklahoma Governor William H. Murray, whose crudeness he despised. Or, well, this is him as the professor. This is what his wife called his banker's picture. So this is him when he's cleaned up, I guess. But he used the word sage to refer to, let's see, I think I got this one. Oh, this is him, the sage, in his amphitheater, okay? Let me, I don't know if I can skip forward. So that's his amphitheater classroom. He's only in his 50s there. So you can see smoking 5 packs a day comes at a pretty heavy cost for a person. We'll see a picture of Alfalfa Bill Murray, who was also known as the Sage of Tishomingo, here in a little bit. Indeed, the phrase sage on a stage is usually deployed as a derogatory stereotype, referring to a teacher who drones on endlessly to his students, rather like a mediocre actor delivering a soliloquy. Professor Kendall was an accomplished, even a thrilling speaker, but in the classroom, he generally sought to avoid lectures, perhaps because he wanted to avoid invidious comparison with his father, Reverend Kendall, whose rhetorical gifts had won renown throughout the Sooner State. Lecture then was not normally Kendall's way. Rather, he used a modified version of the Socratic method. Performing on his classroom stage, he paced back and forth relentlessly, almost always smoking, can't do that anymore, and constantly engaging with his students with questions and dialogue about a primary political text, say the Mayflower Compact or the Declaration of Independence. Students recall him turning suddenly to talk to them and getting up close to look them in the eye, with the pupils in turn fearing that ashes from his cigarette might drop upon them at any time. Any student who came unprepared got the look and received no more questions that day. But he did get his students to think. By avoiding standard interpretations, Kendall forced his listeners and dialogue partners to think, annoying some and entrancing others. Either way, when you were sitting in one of his classes or attending one of his public lectures, he didn't get bored. He kept one's attention partly through his charisma and his knack for saying shocking things, but even more so because he knew what he was talking about, had something worthwhile to say, and passionately desired to convey the truth about his subject. Though Kendall co-wrote a popular textbook, he rarely used textbooks in class. Instead, he preferred to reason together with his students to analyze various foundational documents of politics and political theory. Both in his scholarship and in his teaching, Kendall was a master of the art of close reading, which involves meticulous analysis of primary texts. He apparently picked up this skill from literary critics Cleant Brooks and Robert Penn Warren, both of whom he worked with at LSU in the late 1930s. This technique involves weighing each word of a text carefully to discern the deepest meaning of the author. Brooks and Warren, for example, in their book Understanding Poetry, famously eviscerated Joyce Kilmer's popular poem Trees for its confused imagery and simplistic meter. Close reading can be elucidating but makes great demands on its practitioners. Kendall himself applied this skill to political theory, showing that the works of John Locke and John Stuart Mill, when read closely, that is, word by word and phrase by phrase, were often self-contradictory and confused. Having a teacher who possessed the knack of close reading could, I expect, be terrifying. And indeed, when first exposed to Kendall's primary mode of scholarship, I myself felt trepidation in writing about him, though he's now 50 years in his grave, fearing in the back of my mind what he might have thought about my own imperfect prose. For example, I briefly considered labeling this talk, "My Candle Burns at Both Ends," after the poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay, as symbolizing Kendall's relatively short, turbulent, but creative life. It was my mother's favorite poem. Then to my horror, I realized, a la Brooks, Warren, and Kendall, that a candle cannot in fact burn at both ends without one or both of the ends immediately going out, and that the poem in question was therefore a bad poem, though my mom had loved it. Kendall would surely have picked up on Millay's mistake. Imagining how Kendall, the teacher, might critique one's own writing or comments in class, then must also have been a bit scary. On the other hand, this feeling also likely inspired students, at least conscientious students, to do quality work, knowing that their professor would carefully weigh their every word. By dialoguing with the students and by examining texts with them through close readings, as in going through the U.S. Constitution line by line, Kendall revealed himself as the proverbial guide on the side. What you see here, and this couple of students had told me, when class ended, people still wanted to talk. So they just went over to the cafeteria and continued talking. So he's a guide on the side. I would say, like all good teachers, he worked both as a learned sage and as an experienced guide. Kendall was a difficult person to work with. He always fought with his university colleagues and administrators. But on the other hand, he always took care of his students and treated them generously. None of his students remember him as like a very difficult personality. Almost all of his colleagues and administrators do. He often socialized with his students, went to the, let me show the other sage. This is Alfalfa Bill. Nope, that's not Alfalfa Bill. I gave away my thing, okay. Well, all right, well, you got to the end, so I'll just have to explain that. I thought I had this must be a different version that I saved in a different place. In any case, he often socialized with his students, went to their parties, hung out at their houses, drank with them, even as we have seen, married some of them, although sometimes inappropriately close, at least by today's standards. Such linkages did allow Kendall to build lasting bonds with his students and thereby to facilitate their intellectual and professional growth. He was a frequent house guest of the Buckley family. Buckley himself wrote an amusing picture of Kendall and Brent Bozell watching the Army McCarthy hearings on TV together in 1954. Amid whiskey-fueled male camaraderie, the two men berate one another, and Kendall attacks McCarthy, Bozell's former boss, for being a bully and therefore screwing up a positive chance to promote an anti-communist political agenda. Then former student and former teacher part amicably, vowing to watch the next televised hearing together over drinks. At the University of Dallas, Wilmore and Nellie Kendall held regular pasta dinners for students, tuna casserole on Friday, it was a Catholic school, and spaghetti bolognese on Saturdays. Leopoldo Alvarez fondly recalls Professor Kendall shouting at the TV, "No, that's not the way it is, Walter." They were watching CBS News, and any of you who were watching TV in the 1960s and 70s will know who he was yelling at. Walter Cronkite, of course. So through such socializing, many of Kendall's students came to know him quite well as a person. Such relationships led Kendall to focus intensely on the welfare of his students outside the classroom. Indeed, as we have already noted, he worked jointly with former students on many projects years after the latter's graduation. He served not only as editor for Buckley's National Review, but also for Bozell's brief-lived Catholic magazine known as Triumph. Dropping his own interests, claimed University of Dallas President Donald Cowan, Kendall could be a monomaniac in battling to keep his students on the proper intellectual path. He pushed hard and pulled strings for his students to obtain various academic awards and fellowships. Father Stanley Perry, for example, was a Kendall student at Yale and officially confirmed Kendall into the Catholic faith in 1956. After graduation, Perry remained an intellectual acolyte of Kendall, even while serving as head of the political science department at Notre Dame. Leopoldo Alvarez remembered how hard Kendall worked to get him a good fellowship at the University of Chicago to study with Leo Strauss, though Strauss was himself something of a rival to Kendall in the political theory world. Shortly before his death, Kendall also wangled the offer of a prestigious Woodrow Wilson Fellowship for Sister Mary Bryan Bowles, only to have her Mother Superior order her to refuse the honor. Wilmore Kendall then had a number of characteristics which made him an outstanding teacher. Some of these, his magnetic charm, his intelligence, which Dr. John Alvis said was of a different order than he'd ever known, and perhaps his stubborn contrariness, were unique to him and not easily duplicated by others. Other aspects of his success as a teacher might be more easily copied by those of us with more pedestrian gifts. For example, because of my Kendall research, I've begun to use a more Socratic style of teaching combined with close reading of primary historical texts. For me, the use of such techniques is still a work in progress, but they have already proved quite insightful for myself and for students. Last semester, for example, my students and I carefully went through John C. Calhoun's Disquisition on Government, another book which I'd heard about for a long time but never had actually read. I was floored that the famous essay hardly mentioned either slavery or race, and I'm not sure still what to make of that fact, but it was not at all what I expected when reading about the Disquisition on Government. As teachers, then, we can all know our subjects well, and presumably most of us do, and we should not merely rely on textbooks or secondhand wisdom and providing our own insight to our students. Staying a week ahead of students in the textbook, probably not the best strategy. Maybe here the lessons for universities also is to put well-qualified instructors into classes rather than cheaper but less qualified ones. Hopefully we all believe that when what we teach matters, and that students will benefit by learning it. And if not, we really ought to be doing something else for a living. Kendall the teacher, then, despite his many rough edges and various personality flaws, left an important legacy in public life and in the classroom. For him, there was no real separation between his scholarly work and his teaching. He became, said University of Dallas President Donald Cowan in a funeral eulogy, the very embodiment of his discipline. It was his task to witness to the young through nurturing, guidance, argument, and persuasion. Kendall, Cowan continued, was a great teacher because he gave himself utterly, simple-heartedly, agonizingly, without stint to the vocation he served. Wanting to extend his knowledge to the world, Kendall possessed the habitus of a true teacher. He shared his wisdom jauntily, inviting others freely to join him in the quest for truth and goodness. Cowan went on to say that Kendall had transformed not only the lives of students, but the ethos of the whole university, that is, the University of Dallas. So I started off the talk by saying Wilmer Kendall pursued teaching as a calling, that he dedicated his life to a task that he saw as worth doing. Throughout his career, he continued to nourish the life of his own mind, constantly reading and thinking about politics and political theory. He gave his energy, his time, his wisdom, and ultimately his life for his students. He hoped that they, in turn, might promote and preserve the dream of democracy so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people should not perish. His epitaph, which you see on this slide, reads simply teacher. And I think that that conveys this heartfelt call to teach, which would be beneficial for all of us to have also. Thank you. Take that down. Oh, okay. Any questions? Yeah, Serena?
I apologize for coming late. I had a class that went into the hour, so I had to rush over it from there. But I found it really interesting, his relationship with his students in comparison to his colleagues. And would be interested in hearing a little more about what were some of the disputes he had with his colleagues, because that is usually reversed, I think, where people can have students who grudge them, that relationship can be strained in some ways and they're fine with their colleagues. I mean, it varies, but I wonder why was he always arguing with his colleagues? What was that about? And I find that interesting of how that contrasts to his relationship with the students.
I think a lot of it has to do with his childhood, because he had a pretty difficult childhood, arguing with his father a lot, and he disliked anyone being in a position of authority over him, and also he felt pretty intensely about his beliefs, and so if you read about it, it's amazing, because it says he's a person who you could get into a shouting match with faster than anyone you ever met. But it never with students, always with colleagues or administrators. So he just had a particularly contentious personality. And then I think sometimes as a conservative in the academy, you might think everyone's out to get you anyway. And so you're ready to see people maybe that there's not a plot, but they're out to sabotage you when maybe they're not. So he may have seen some of that too, or maybe they are. But some of it's that, but I think it's more of a personality quirk. But he did not berate people. He did not berate his underlings. So there was a meeting. It was talking about in the Cold War where he comes into the Yale faculty meeting. It's the whole department, and they're talking about McCarthy. And Kendall comes in and listens about an hour, and he says, "Hey guys, I just talked to the janitor outside, and what he said in a minute made more sense than what all of you together have said in the last 90 minutes." So that was the kind of thing he did. So that was fun, but it may be fun if you witnessed it from a distance. They argued that he never could have more than like 2 friends at a time. So he broke with Bozell and Buckley before the end. So if you read Buckley's obituary of him, he says, one of the greatest thinkers of our time, but his enemies were as numerous as the stars. You know, he was just a hard person to get along with on an individual basis. But it's interesting, I never ran across students who said that ever. Well, maybe 20 years later, but he didn't treat students that way at all. So that was just his persona, which was fun. He loved to argue. Actually, the people he got along best with were people who loved to argue with him. And it wasn't ideological. So some of his best friends were like pretty left-wing, almost communist professors who didn't get offended by what he said and who argued back with him. Those were some of his closest friends. So anyway.
You mentioned the CIA.
Uh-huh.
How long was he involved in that kind of?
Well, he's really, that's the part I'm really digging out now. So he was part of what some people have called the kind of the military academic complex. So he was a person of the left before World War II. Then he got brought into Army intelligence, worked for some of the precursors of the CIA. He was fluent in Spanish and French. So he worked with the State Department, Army intelligence, Air Force intelligence, the OSS, and the CIA at different points in time. And he wrote some of the first things on what should an intelligence analyst do as their job description. And I found some interesting articles of all things, advertising journals about the Korean War propaganda and how good it was that they convinced over 100,000 enemy soldiers to surrender through writing really effective propaganda, and that advertising agencies kind of took off some of the lessons that they used there and applied it to getting you to buy refrigerators or whatever also. So yeah, he was pretty important. And even after he starts teaching at Yale, he goes kind of back and forth between the academic world and the world of the intelligence community. Yeah. But, he didn't get along with people in the CIA either. So he fought with his superiors there also. So, yeah, not an easy person to manage, I suppose, which makes him fun, I think, anyway.
When will your book be ready?
Whenever I can get time to write it. I've gotten a lot of research done. There's one main collection that I still have to do, which are the Buckley papers at Yale. And Buckley's son, Christopher Buckley, has given me permission. So that'll take me 2 or 3 weeks. And then I just need to write because I think I'm able to. I have got a couple of pubs out of it, papers. So I'm at the point pretty close to I can just write it if ever I get the time to do that. So yeah, it should be fun. Dan gave me a biography of the philosopher Heidegger, who I still have no idea what Heidegger's pretty high up there. But so some biographies talk about a person's thought, without really dealing too much into their life. But he had such a kind of crazy life that it seems like I got to really talk about him and his personality. That you should read that Saul Bellows Mosby's memoirs. It'll give you some insight to his personality, because he was like he said he was described as some of the persons who, came up with some of the cleverest but craziest political ideas ever, or something like that. So he's contemplating death in Mexico, looking at the pyramids. So pretty interesting stuff. Yeah, he had he knew really interesting friends. Had an affair with the writer Catherine Ann Porter. Had an affair with a lot of people. But he had a dynamic personality. A lot of it is rooted in Oklahoma too. A lot of his ideas. So, anyway.
She was Texan.
She was from Texas. She was like 20 years older than him, but they knew one another well at LSU. So, I mean, I read one thing, it's like, you got to lock up the faculty wives when Wilmar comes into town, so anyway, party animal, I guess. I like the blue plaid. I liked the purple plaid suit, so anyway. So, yeah.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I don't know if other people have insights, but I thought it was interesting how you focus on him as a teacher,
Mhm.
because of how, theoretical a lot of this can get when he's talking and, presenting, but the teaching aspect, the influence on his pedagogy, and even just the connections between the close reading and how that affects that intersection of scholarship and teaching, and
Right.
he kind of embodies that.
Right.
Did he, I don't know, obviously everyone called him the teacher and that's how they thought of it, but I think it's interesting the difference between a teacher and a professor too, right? How people differentiate
Sure.
that, of are you professing or what makes the teacher different? Are you delving into that?
I hadn't really thought
did he
about
go by
that.
Professor, yeah.
I think professor might be a better word for him, because he was so focused on political theory. I mean, that really was his life. He woke up thinking about it, I guess, over a cigarette. Went to bed thinking about it over a cigarette, but he had scotch, but he thought about it all the time. And so that really is, where the UD president says that he was like the embodiment of his discipline. It's like he lived and breathed political theory 24/7. And he tried to profess what he thought was the truth to his students and attract them to that idea too. Thanks. No questions from the distance, people?
No questions from us.
None here.
Fascinating stories, though.
All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Owen. It was very interesting. I look forward to your book.
Oh, good.
Yes.
I'll need people to buy it. My last one's all about 200 copies.
We'll buy.
What was your last book about?
Methodists.
Thank you all for coming.
All right.
And just a plug for our next and final HAWK Talk. It will take place on Tuesday, April 30th at 3 p.m. And that will feature Dr. David Scott. He's going to be talking about the U.S. Presidential debate system from 1948 to 2016. So that includes Trump. So I'm sure that will be quite an interesting conversation as well. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.